In May of 1852, the marble auction block inside New Orleans' St. Louis Hotel had seen everything a slave society could offer: desperation, cruelty, indifference, profit. Men, women, and children had been sold there under chandeliers, their lives reduced to bids spoken casually by men in fine coats. But on May 14, something happened that the hotel would later try very hard to erase. A young man stepped onto that block and declared himself free. His name was Jean-Baptiste Deveau. And for a brief moment, the entire system hesitated. Jean-Baptiste was 23 years old. He spoke French fluently, wrote elegantly, dressed well, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that unsettled people who expected submission. He had been raised believing himself to be free. He had papers from France. He had an education. And yet, on that day, he stood on the auction block as property. The man who claimed to own him was Anatole Deveau, a wealthy planter from Rivière-au-Can plantation, respected in New Orleans society, known for his business sense and his carefully cultivated reputation. Anatole said Jean-Baptiste was his slave. More than that, he claimed Jean-Baptiste had been born enslaved, the son of an enslaved woman named Celeste. Jean-Baptiste said this was a lie. The auction was stopped mid-sale, not because of mercy, but because Jean-Baptiste did something few enslaved people ever dared to do in public: he spoke. Calmly. Clearly. In perfect French. He stated his name, his origin, his father's identity, and declared that he was a free man being illegally sold. The crowd reacted with confusion, irritation, and curiosity. Some laughed. Others whispered. A few grew angry. But the auctioneer hesitated. Selling a free man was a crime. And Jean-Baptiste's certainty made ignoring him dangerous. What followed was not justice, but delay. Jean-Baptiste was taken into custody, not as a slave returned to his owner, and not as a free man released, but as something undefined. His status was suspended while the courts examined his claim. And this is where the story becomes far more unsettling. Louisiana law followed the principle of partus sequitur vent rem, status followed the mother. If Jean-Baptiste's mother had been enslaved at the time of his birth, he was enslaved. If she had been free, he was free. Everything depended on a woman who was not present, not alive to testify, and barely documented at all. Jean-Baptiste claimed his mother was free in France. Anatole claimed she was an enslaved woman named Celeste, owned by his plantation. But here's the problem. No one could definitively prove either version. There were French records suggesting Jean-Baptiste had been born free. There was testimony claiming otherwise. But there were no plantation inventories listing Celeste before Jean-Baptiste's arrival. No purchase records. No sale records. No birth records for other children. She existed only in testimony. On May 17, 1852, Judge Thibault, a man known for careful deliberation and a certain sympathy toward free people of color, issued his ruling. It was a masterpiece of legal ambiguity. The court declared that Jean-Baptiste's status could not be definitively determined from the available evidence. Therefore, the attempted sale was void. Anatole could not sell Jean-Baptiste as a slave unless he could prove beyond reasonable doubt that Jean-Baptiste had been born enslaved. The burden of proof was placed entirely on Anatole. Until such proof was produced, Jean-Baptiste could not be held in slavery. But, and this is crucial, Jean-Baptiste also could not immediately claim the full rights of a free person. He existed in a legal gray zone. Not enslaved. Not free. Suspended between identities. The practical result was this: Jean-Baptiste was released from custody, but barred from leaving Louisiana without permission. Anatole was prohibited from claiming him as property. The case remained technically open, though everyone involved knew that additional evidence was unlikely to ever appear. It was a non-ruling that protected everyone except the truth. When Jean-Baptiste walked out of the Cabildo that afternoon, He carried only what he had arrived in New Orleans with, the clothes on his back and a small leather trunk. Anatole returned the trunk without comment. Inside were Jean-Baptiste's French papers, Judge Thibau's ruling, and a letter from the French consulate stating that they recognized him as a French citizen and would offer what assistance they could. He had no home. He knew no one in the city. He had approximately $8, paid quietly for weeks of secretarial work he had done for Anatole, handed over by a lawyer without explanation. He stood on the street outside the Cabildo, looking at New Orleans, a city where he was neither one thing nor another, and felt something that was equal parts terror and exhilaration. He was free. Not cleanly. Not completely. But enough. He was alive. What happened next is where history dissolves into legend. Some accounts say Jean-Baptiste left New Orleans that very day and was never seen again in Louisiana. Others claim he stayed for several weeks, working quietly as a French tutor under an assumed name, saving enough money to leave. In August 1853, a newspaper in Cincinnati published a small notice seeking a French tutor named J.B. Devoe. In 1854, the French consulate received a letter signed only J.B., thanking them for their intervention and stating that he was well, free, and beginning again. Some accounts say Jean-Baptiste left New Orleans that very day and was never seen again in Louisiana. Others claim he stayed for several weeks, working quietly as a French tutor under an assumed name, saving enough money to leave. In August 1853, a newspaper in Cincinnati published a small notice seeking a French tutor named J.B. Devoe. In 1854, the French consulate received a letter signed only J.B., thanking them for their intervention and stating that he was well, free, and beginning again. A stable hand named Thomas later told others at Rivière-au-Can that he saw Jean-Baptiste 3 days after the auction, walking north along the river road at dawn, dressed in rough work clothes, carrying a small bundle. Thomas said he called out to him, and Jean-Baptiste turned, smiled, put a finger to his lips, and kept walking. Whether this actually happened or was a story people needed to believe, no one can say. What is documented is what happened to Anatole Devoe. Anatole's plantation remained profitable. His business continued. But his standing in New Orleans society never recovered. The story of the auction spread quietly. Whispers in drawing rooms. Mentions in private letters. Rumors that he had tried to sell his own nephew. That he had stolen a free man's papers. That he had stood by while a young man was humiliated on the auction block. Whether Jean-Baptiste had been legally free almost didn't matter. What mattered was that Anatole had violated something deeper, a code of honor, of family, of restraint. In 1859, Anatole received a package with no return address. Inside was a French edition of the Count of Monte Cristo. On the title page, written in elegant script, was a quote. "We are brothers. We who suffer from the same wound." Anatole recognized the handwriting immediately. He burned the book the same day. But his daughter, Marguerite, saw it first and wrote about it in her diary. That diary survived. The message was unmistakable. The Count of Monte Cristo was a story about wrongful imprisonment, escape, reinvention, and quiet revenge. Whether Jean-Baptiste was threatening Anatole or simply marking a parallel, Anatole took it as a threat. He hired private investigators. They found nothing. He increased security at the plantation. Slept with a loaded pistol. Declined rapidly, physically, mentally, spiritually. He died in 1862 during the Union occupation of New Orleans. The doctor called it nervous exhaustion and melancholia. He was 66. In his final weeks, servants reported that he spoke in French to people who weren't there, often arguing with someone he called the boy. "I gave you shelter," he said repeatedly. "I did what was necessary." The St. Louis Hotel continued holding auctions for another decade, but the auction of May 14, 1852 was never mentioned again in its records. The documentation disappeared. The bills of sale. The bidder agreements. The suspension records. As if the event had been erased. Except it wasn't. The story persisted in French Creole households. In private letters. In legal discussions. It became a legend, the beautiful slave who declared himself free and vanished. And here's what makes the story truly disturbing. Jean-Baptiste was almost certainly telling the truth. The French records were real. The consulate confirmation was real. Christophe Devo's marriage was documented. And the enslaved woman named Celeste does not appear in plantation records before Jean-Baptiste's arrival. No inventory. No purchase. No sale. Which suggests something darker than enslavement. Fabrication. If that's true, then what happened at the St. Louis Hotel wasn't just an auction gone wrong, it was the exposure of a carefully constructed fraud. In 1853, the Louisiana legislature sealed the auction records. They remain sealed to this day. The official reason is privacy concerns for potentially living descendants. But Jean-Baptiste was born around 1829. Any descendants would now be generations removed. Historians have petitioned for access. Every request has been denied. Which raises the question, what is still dangerous in those files? Proof of fraud? Complicity by prominent families? Or evidence of where Jean-Baptiste went and what name he used? The last recorded reference comes from 1897, when a researcher interviewed a 93-year-old woman who remembered the auction. You could see it in how he stood, she said. Free people stand differently. Maybe the question isn't where Jean-Baptiste went. Maybe the question is why we still look. Because Jean-Baptiste did something rare. He refused to disappear quietly. He said his own name. He claimed his identity publicly. He forced the system to confront him. And then, on his own terms, he vanished. That's not erasure. That's transformation. And maybe that's why, nearly 2 centuries later, we're still telling his story.